The maid left a note in the prince's room. "You're in danger. Flee while there's time." The bell after Compline left the corridors shivering with silence. Even Versailles slept with one eye open. Claire knew those hours when the palace's grandeur loosened and the service ways owned the night. The stones breathed cold through the seams in the woodwork. A draught carried the smell of tallow and soap, laced with the faint tang of vinegar the scullions used to scour copper. She carried no more than a rag and a bucket, a candle stub cupped in her palm, the flames screened from sight by the curve of her fingers. She moved on the balls of her feet, counting boards that creaked and boards that did not. The passages behind the gilded rooms wound tight as thread around a button. She could reach any door in the wing without crossing the marble that courtiers adored. The sound reached her first as the shift of breath. Two men on the far side of a stretched tapestry, their words thinned by old stone. It was not a languid conversation. The rhythm had intention. Phrases rose like the edges of a map. Private supper. Draught, carefully measured. Aile de Boeuf rotation at the half. She leaned her shoulder to the cold flank of the wall and let the sound settle. The tapestry, heavy with dust and woven birds, muttered against the stone with each small movement of air. She could not see faces. She did not need to. Men who planned used clean words. There was no gambling in their tone, no laughter, only the calibration of time. Her pulse steadied by choice. Panic broke things. Calm tightened them. She withdrew soundlessly, back through a slit black passage to a closet where broom handles thudded softly if you brushed them wrong. Inside, she pressed the rag flat on a shelf and dug with her fingers until she found the scrap she had hidden weeks ago. A charred stick, no longer than a thumb, chalky black on skin. On a torn piece of a ruined ledger cover, brown, frayed, smelling of starch, she wrote the only sentence that mattered, each letter forced through the rasp of the paper. "You're in danger. Flee while there's time." No title, no highness, no signature. The letters shook, then steadied. She breathed over it so the dust would settle into the fibers. If she hesitated, she would never move. The candle's flame found her face and doubled in her eyes. That was enough of fear. She took the service stairs two at a time, skirting a landing where the night porter left his stool. The porter snored low, chin to chest. The corridor beyond ran blind until a panel gave into the prince's outer study. The latch at this hour was a fickle mood. Sometimes it caught, sometimes it sulked open. She slid the nail she kept in her apron seam into the gap and lifted. The wooden tongue complained. She stilled and let silence absorb the noise. The breath of the palace returned, a distant tick, a thread of wind. The panel eased. She stepped through the seam into wainscoted dark and shut air behind her back. The study smelled of wax and paper. Moonlight skimmed the instruments on the desk, quill, standish, a blotter stained in the corners where ink had dried in a hurry. The desk itself, heavy and golden, sat like a miniature sun in a room that rejected daylight. The prince's hand had once pressed along its edge as he learned to sign his name. The thought came and went like a cough. She laid the note in the center of the blotter, not tucked under anything, not hidden, seen. The words faced up, a black strip through pale. Her fingers realized what her mind had not. The rough ledger paper caught on the lip of a half-open drawer. A corner tugged back at her. She eased, tried to flatten the page, and felt an edge tear away. The scrap flicked loose, a triangle no larger than a fingernail, and skittered under the curved foot of the desk. She did not chase it. To reach would be to knock the chair, to move the world. She smoothed what lay and wiped her fingertips on her apron. The rag she returned to the bucket. Habit carried cleanliness into danger, because habit was how you survived a palace that noticed lint on the wrong cushion. She retreated as she had come, counting again the boards that would complain, slipping into the maw of the panel before the room remembered it had a door. The panel kissed shut and erased her. She did not go. She stayed in the rib of the wall, in the breath of cold that ran behind wood and paint. A slit cut long ago for maintenance let a blade of light pass between the plaster and the study. It was enough to watch a shadow fall when someone entered. It was enough to hear paper move. If no one came, the message would sit and shrivel like a seed that never found rain. If someone came, the palace would wake. Her lips formed a soundless prayer she no longer attached to saints. Bootsteps in the outer passage approached, slowed, split. One set continued, a servant's shuffle. Another set landed lighter, practiced. The outer door to the study opened with the deference a hinge makes when it has been oiled by a careful hand. He entered without the clamor that precedes kings. The air shifted. The flame of a candle crossed the floor in a shallow arc. He closed the door himself, a small breach of habit, then set the candlestick on the desk and stood still. From the narrow seam, she could see only his sleeve, a glimmer of blue silk, a button snared in light. The room waited for him to breathe. When he did, it sounded like a man collecting his name from where he had put it down. His gaze fell to the paper because anything new in a room is a declaration. He read the line in silence. His hand did not snatch. It hovered. He lifted the note with 2 fingers, and the bottom edge, where the tear had begun, melted away. The tiny triangle slid free from wherever it had hidden and fell with an unshowy whisper, slipping to the floor, then under the desk's carved foot. He crouched, the silk knee whispering against itself. His hand reached under the foot and drew out the stray piece. He held it near the candle. Purple ink rested in the corner of the scrap in the faint crescent of an old stamp, one she knew too well from months of inventory. Linen room, the smear of authority that lived on every ledger page they turned. His jaw tightened. Not rage, recognition. He turned the note over. He looked at the desk as if trying to ask it whether it had invited this intruder. He did not call for a crowd. He set the scrap beneath the note and passed his thumb lightly along the torn edge, aligning what could not be mended. He rang for no one. He crossed to the door, opened it with soft caution, and sent a whisper along the corridor that traveled quickly and without ceremony. A word to a man who knew how to move a guard a pace or 2 without changing the world. Nothing more. If a prince flinched, the palace turned that flinch into a fact that could not be contained. He returned to the desk. Candlelight stitched across his features and left them half-stitched. He read the sentence again, a single line that cut through everything taught to him about obeying the room. "You're in danger," he murmured, not as an echo but as a question pressed into air. His mouth closed on the rest. Flee while there's time. A command he had never been given because he was supposed to be the reason others fled or stayed. He lifted his eyes and let them rest on the paneling. He did not know where the shadow spaces led. He knew they existed the way one knows a river runs underneath a city. He had been warned since childhood that walls listen. He did not move toward them. He paced once, twice, the measured length of someone taught to keep the body's need for motion secret beneath well-cut clothes. The note lay on the gold, like a wound. He set the candle beside it, as if illuminating the threat could soften its edges. From beyond the door, a single knock, a breath of voice, a messenger trained to speak in phrases that did not panic households. The prince listened and let the information unfold like the slow unfurling of a fan. A figure had been seen in his wing during the forbidden hour. The man who spoke did not name a face, only a shape. He used the words he had been given, and no more. The prince nodded once. He did not ask who had seen what. He would know soon enough who loved the sound of their own warnings. He let the door close. He turned the note over in his fingers again and pressed it flat. If it was a trap, it was elegant. If it was mercy, it was desperate. He lifted the note to slide it into a drawer, then stopped, choosing instead to keep it where it had been placed. To hide it was to give it a guilty face. To leave it out was to allow the room to be honest. A breath of cold slipped across the floor. It came from nowhere, a candle could explain. She felt that same breath press her cheek. The wall held her by the back of her coat. Her lungs argued with her. Draw, hold, draw, hold. The corridor beyond the panel, her corridor, had gained weight. It was the weight of men, voices quiet and clipped. One belonged to a man who had not yet learned to wear authority in his throat. Another carried the tired patience of someone who had. The orders were precise. They would search the service passages nearest the prince's study first. The words carried across the wood like the scrape of a blade. She zipped herself into stillness. To run would be to announce the existence of a place to run to. The panel at her back had a give to it. People had used it recently. Dust lifted in a faint taste of chalk. She pressed 2 fingers to the seam where the light slid in and felt the edge tremble as footsteps stamped the other side. "Here," a voice said, too near. The latch that held the panel in its frame wore the scars of old hands. It also bore a trick. If the wood swelled with damp, the catch snagged and refused to yield without a nudge. Her palm found that bite mark. She pressed her weight against it, balancing between giving way and holding. If she fought too hard, the wood would creak. If she yielded too soon, she would lose cover. Time slowed until it thickened. The torchlight on the other side of the wood blurred and sharpened through the slit. She saw the gleam of iron spearheads. She smelled the oil in the leather. One boot scuffed in impatience. Another tapped a measured rhythm against necessity. A knuckle knocked wood. She did not move. Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was courtesy extended to a door considered noble, even in the bowels of the wall. "Lift," someone whispered. The latch rattled, and then, for a breath, stopped. The quiet that followed was louder than the movement had been. She thought of her mother bending over a basin, wrists red from rinsing. She thought of the ledger where her name had been written on her first day, set among columns of linen counts and household ephemera. She thought of the prince's face, which she had only ever seen at a distance, and how he had left rooms as if they had held more of him than he could afford to leave behind. Her shoulder burned. She could not tell whether she held the panel or the panel held her. On the other side of the study, the prince registered motion in his peripheral vision. Not the spying motion of a servant with more curiosity than sense, the organized motion of the garde du corps when they carried a report. His hand left the note and found the edge of the desk. The familiar wood steadied his skin. The officer who entered wore duty like a second coat. He bowed no deeper than necessary, his eyes taking a quick inventory that included the candle, the note, and the tightened line of the prince's mouth. He shut the door with the discretion of a man who knew what walls could repeat. "Highness," he said, with the smallest nod. "A figure was seen in your wing." "Where?" the prince asked, and the word had more weight than its size. "In the passage near the lesser study." The patrols marked fresh air from an inner seam. The prince did not allow triumph or fear to color his tone. "You are searching." "We are, Highness. We begin where such seams are nearest." The prince considered the officer's face, looking for the way men concealed eagerness to please behind protocol. He found only the ancient habit of a soldier, carefully avoiding any thought that would force him to lie. "Proceed," he said. "Quietly. Wake no one who need not wake." A pause emptied the space between them, of everything except breath. The officer glanced, again without indulging curiosity, at the paper on the desk. He did not ask. He would not be invited. He bowed and left. The prince closed the door himself and stood in the center of the room. He did not pace now. He listened. He heard, through layers of wood and plaster, the faint complaint of a latch under pressure. The palace had a language, taught to him by years of nothing ever being truly private. Tonight it spoke. "Whoever you are," he said softly, not raising his voice enough to carry beyond the door, "you are either my death or my chance." The words surprised him with their honesty. He had not meant to make an admission to the dark. He moved to the paneling and laid flat a palm. He could not feel her through the wood. He felt only splinters and the muscle strain he used to keep his hand from trembling. He stepped back to the desk, returned the note to the center of the blotter, and took up the candlestick. He lifted it a fraction higher. Light seeped around corners that usually kept a shadow. If someone emerged into the room, he would meet them with flame and a name. Outside, in the artery of the palace that ran just behind the wall, a guard hissed under his breath at the man beside him. Careful. Careful meant too much, and not enough. The hallway breathed. Claire closed her eyes and let herself trust the minute lesson the old carpenter had once taught the laundresses, bored with mending broken handles. Woodlikes angle more than brute force. She shifted her weight along a line that let the latch hold without declaring war. The holding could not last. The patter of orders grew near, passed, returned. More boots. A third voice, lower. They would not give up on the first refusal. They would listen, and when listening failed, they would test, and when tests failed, they would insist. Inside the study, the prince heard a second set of steps coming faster. He knew the cadence of urgency migrating toward command. He had chosen quiet. The night had chosen necessity. In the pane of the window, the small flame of his candle looked like a star trying to speak to a storm. He placed the candlestick down with a care that contradicted the chaos he felt. He could not shout. He could not run. He could only prepare to make his face unreadable and his voice lawful if someone who should not be in his room suddenly was. He felt the decision settle over him like a cloak he had been wearing since birth. He would protect the warning, even if it led men straight to the person who had brought it. He would not be the prince who tore apart the hand that had tried to save him, even if the hand belonged to someone the palace would call disposable in the morning. He drew a breath, the sort you draw before stepping into a public room. He looked at the door that led to his bedchamber and considered for a heartbeat locking it, then did not. Locks rattled when tested. Noise was the enemy of dignity. The seam at the edge of the panel on the other side of the wall quivered. The guard's hand found the latch. The wood gave a fraction and held, then gave a whisper more. Metal kissed air. Torchlight widened along the invisible joint and slid across the scuffed boards of the concealed passage, turning dust into gold for a heartbeat before it burned it out. Claire's fingers slipped on the worn ridge of the catch. Her shoe pressed into splintered wood. Her breath caught and would not release. The hidden panel eased open on its concealed hinge, and the gleam of a pike tip entered the dark, stopping inches from the hem of her skirt. The pike tip hovered in a tight circle of torchlight. It stopped so close to Claire's hem that a single ash fleck might have bridged the gap. The guard's breath reached her first, lathered with oil and garlic, then the murmur of a second man behind him. "See there?" "Dust," the other said, low. "Or someone clever." The metal nudged forward. It touched nothing but the chill that lives behind walls. Claire pressed her spine into stone. Linen against plaster. Her hands flattened over the latch that had betrayed and saved her in the same heartbeat. She counted, not as a servant, but as someone keeping time with danger. 1, 2, 3. The torch moved. Light widened over the rough boards of the secret passage. Dust turned bright, then fell like snow. A boot creaked, leather bending. The pike withdrew an inch. The guard leaned in and let the beam rake the narrow space. A spider's thread trembled like a wire. "Shall we open it?" "Not wide," the older voice answered. "We keep it quiet. His Highness asked for quiet." They respected quiet the way soldiers respect a loaded weapon. The younger man lifted the panel a finger more. The hinge took it as a sigh. Claire's toes touched the edge of a knot in the wood. She placed her weight there because knots do not complain. If she shifted wrong, the pike would find cloth, and cloth would betray flesh. If she held too long, her calf would shake and her shoe would rasp the floor. Every choice had a sound. A third voice, distant along the passage, whispered a name she did not know and a warning she understood. Footsteps. Move. The pike drew back. The panel eased inward, then halted, as if remembering itself. The guard let the wood rest against the pull of her hand without grasping that he was not the only force holding it. "Close it," the older voice said. "We take the next seam." If there's a shadow, it will run. The panel settled. The metal tip vanished. The torch walked away, stamping light onto the ribs of the corridor until distance swallowed it. Only the cool draft remained, licking at her shoes like a cat. Claire stood very still, then counted again to be sure stillness had taken. 1, 2, 10. She breathed, small. Her palms peeled from the wood with a soft stick. Her fingers tingled. She did not trust her knees. She eased backward along the passage, skimming the wall with her skirt to erase her shape. At the junction, she took the branch that led away from the prince's study, away from the men who knew how to look into darkness and find fear. Silence in a palace is never empty. It is a held breath. It is the weight of people in other rooms pretending to sleep. She slid down the service stair like rain, 1 step per heartbeat, to the floor where the laundry sat warm and blind. In the laundry, the air smelled of damp linen and lye. A woman's snore came and went like surf behind a half-closed door. Baskets leaned like tired beasts. She set her rag where it had been meant to be all along. She dipped the end into a bucket to dampen the soot marks on her fingers. The soot did not entirely leave. That was fine. Work disguised everything. A bell chimed somewhere distant. Not a court bell. The small bell that keeps servants in rhythm with a house that eats hours. The night retreated. It did not break. It bent and kept bending until it became morning. The light reached the service windows like a pale apology. Claire wrung a cloth and watched steam coil. Hands moving, mind elsewhere. That elsewhere was the desk she had seen for the first time with a candle's proof. The gold, the blotter, the sentence lying on it like a cut. She had touched something forbidden. She had left behind a mark she had not meant to leave. The purple stamp on a torn corner. Linen room. She could feel the stamp on her tongue like a sour. Nothing in her workday could alter that. Only labor. Only precision. She made herself useful. Useful people are ignored. Durée. The steward's voice found her as surely as a hook finds a loop. He approached with a ledger held up like a shield. The ledger had the weight of authority, but its pages were not heavy. They lay thin as skin. Your route, he said. Hunt for dust, not for trouble. Yes, monsieur. You were seen on the higher landing last night. The chief dislikes silhouettes where they should not be. Deliveries were late, she said, choosing a truth that could be true. I returned the cloths. The stair is the shortest. His eyes measured her face for the trick inside her words. He liked catching tricks. It gave form to his day. You did not return cloths to the prince's study. No, she said. I do not clean the study. He waited to see if she would say more. She did not. He twitched the ledger closed. Mind your napkins. The dinner is formal tonight. Her heart slid once against her ribs. Formal meant a longer line of eyes, more hands, more places to hide a danger. She bowed her head and moved on. The palace was awake. Powder drifted through air that was never fresh. The great clock ticked. An army of feet tramped silence into order. She threaded the garde-manger first. Cold clung to the slabs. Glass jars winked in neat rows. On the center table, cloths had been laid for the trimming of fruits. Lemons rolled under a cook's palm, bruising oil and scent into fingers. Beside the basket sat an opaque bottle hooded with cloth. Its cap bore a seal pressed deep into wax. She lifted the corner of the cloth an inch, enough to see the seal, then let it fall. The physician's mark, the private stores, not the usual suite. A chalk line ticked across the board near the bottle. A mark the steward made when something should be carried upward later. It was white, like bone. Claire did not stare. Staring gets noticed. She memorized the curve of the chalk. She memorized the way the bottle's neck had a chip like a tooth. Move along, the steward said behind her, not unkindly. Not kind. She nodded and moved. In the bakery, someone laughed too softly. Flour hung in the air like dawn. A footman leaned his hip against a table and looked at no one. His other hand touched another hand. The exchange was quick and stupid. Coins clicked. A small folded scrap traveled from palm to cuff. "Not here," a voice muttered. The footman smiled with his eyes, not his mouth, and turned his back to knead gossip into dough. His cuffs were clean. He should not have clean cuffs. Claire took a breath laced with yeast and heat and swallowed it as if it could calm hunger. She did not have the luxury of pausing long enough to decide whether what she had seen mattered. Everything mattered. Nothing did until it struck. She made her way to the cabinets where napkins were counted, folded, and folded again until they obeyed. The linen's surface was smooth as thinking. She chose one at random, then rejected randomness. She chose the napkin that would go to the prince's place. The steward liked symmetry. The steward liked sameness. But the steward also liked marking things. That chalk line next to the bottle would have its mirror somewhere in the choreography of table setting. She took a thread from her pocket. Blue. Not bright. A forgetting blue. She worried it into the hem of the napkin with 2 small stitches at the back of a corner. Invisible, if you were not searching for it. Obvious if you were. It would let her know which setting was meant to be his. The thread felt like treason. The action felt like breathing. Outside, a corridor flooded with the tide of the levee. Backs straightened because backs must. Shoes scuffed into velvet. Servants bowed to coats, and coats pretended not to see servants. Only to see a servant is to admit you are balanced on them. Claire kept to her line and did not lift her head unless duty demanded. She passed the antechamber of the prince's rooms during the hour when attendants shifted like benches at mass. She let her eyes widen a fraction because there were changes there. A Swiss guard stood 1 pace nearer than usual. A footman from the other wing had been called to replace the sleepy one, whose body could be counted on to betray him at the wrong hour. The chamberlain, roused before he wished, yawned behind elegant fingers and counted keys twice. The palace stitched itself thicker when threatened. It never pulled thread. It added layers. She did not slow. Slowing invites questions. She carried her stack of napkins as if they were the only thing in the world that required arms. She reached the small room where sideboards were staged before the evening meal. Private kitchen beyond. Silver domes stacked like moons awaiting their turn. The cupbearer rehearsed his steps with a flagon in each hand, water in one, wine in the other. Rehearsal was not for show. Rehearsal prevented spill, stain, shame. "Careful with the stemware," he said to no one and everyone. "Cut crystal chips if you look at it wrong." His glance skated over Claire and did not land. She preferred glances that skimmed. She set the napkins in their stack. She moved aside to allow a boy to pass with a tray of lemons. The bottle with the physician's seal had moved too. It now sat near a sink, cloth still hooding it, close enough to be called on, far enough not to attract idle fingers. The chalk mark on the board next to it had been erased and redrawn. Someone had thought about it. A voice, light, oily with courtesy, drifted from the doorway to the private kitchen. "The physician's parcel came late. We hold it for the prince's table." Claire had never heard the maître d'hôtel sound quite like that. His sentences usually had ends. These ones slid away. "Is there a need?" another voice asked. "Only instructions." Only instructions. Words that could carry anything inside them. Claire swallowed and dared nothing. She arranged the cutlery in the order that makes men feel important. The day wore itself thin, then thickened again as candles were brought and flint struck and tiny suns woke in their cups of glass. The dinner hour came with predictable glory. Wax light made mirrors alive. The room shook with controlled radiance. The long cloth on the table fell without a wrinkle. She took her place behind a gilded screen at the edge of the prince's dining room. Her job would be to hand towels, to catch what must not hit the carpet, to be present without being present. The screen carved grape leaves with humorless joy. Between its vines, she could see. Her eyes went first to the blue thread napkin. It lay precisely where it should. At the prince's place, the corner tucked just so, the two invisible stitches hidden in shadow, a dot of thread in a sea of white. He entered with the kind of silence that is not silence. His steps were the measure his tutors had beaten into him. He greeted what must be greeted. He placed his hand where a hand must lie. He sat when the room demanded he sit. She watched his face from his side. He had slept, or he had practiced looking like a man who had slept. The space around his mouth bore no trace of a night's strain. Only his eyes, when they lowered to the table, changed. They hardened a fraction, and the fraction was enough to read if you had ever looked at men who carry more than a tray. The cupbearer approached in his measured arc. Water, wine, the ritual's spine. "Wine, Highness," he said, voice pitched to respect. Nothing more. The prince gave the nod that meant yes to wine the way one nods to rain. The cupbearer tipped the flagon. The wine fell in a slim red rope. The crystal answered with a faint, clean sound. He set the goblet on the table before the prince, with the precision that keeps lives from changing. Claire watched his hands. They did not tremble. She watched his eyes. They did something a perfect servant's eyes never do. They flicked left, quick, a fisherman's glance to a line. Where? To whom? To what? Her gaze tracked the flick, hit the edge of the sideboard, found nothing to call a crime. Then she returned to the stem he had just released. A thumbprint fog faded on crystal. Marks mean hands. Hands mean people. The prince reached for the goblet. He did it the way he had done it 1,000 times, which made the action more dangerous than any clumsy grasp. Repetition is a mask. It hides nerves. It hides traps. Claire took one step forward behind the screen, just enough to be ready, not enough to announce herself. The steward hovered near the door to the private kitchen, practicing the art of being present and absent. The maître d'hôtel stood 5 paces in, the perfect axis of a room that loved axes. A footman shifted weight, back foot to front, to ease a cramp. He winced. He swallowed it. He looked at the floor. Claire traced a path between the bottle in the garde-manger, the chalk, the napkin, the flagon. The line was thin and taut as a violin string. One note, and it would sing. The goblet in the prince's hand tilted. The wine gave a mirror to flame and stole it. She saw then the smallest wrong thing. The flagon the cupbearer had used wore a smear at its neck where the cloth had not quite polished out a mark. The mark matched the chip she had seen on the physician's bottle. Not the same object. The same fingerprint of handling. The same hands had moved near both. Her body moved before her mind permitted it. Reflex born in a corridor where survival depends on being ahead of sound. She stepped out from behind the screen, not with a rush that would break the room, but with the speed of a servant correcting a fold. A correction is permitted. A correction is invisible. In that breath, a boy carrying a dish passed in front of the prince, giving her the cover of motion. The cupbearer turned his head an inch, as if he had heard a fly. Claire's hands lifted and hovered at the edge of the prince's place. She would not touch him. She would not touch what he held. She would touch the base of the goblet, as if to steady it against a wobble. The prince's wrist bent. He brought the rim toward his lips. "Careful," the steward murmured from the door, to no one and everyone, too quiet for a man at table to hear, and just loud enough for a woman behind a screen. Her heel pressed the floor. Her weight shifted. The room narrowed to the circle of crystal, the arc of a hand, the fine line of a mouth. The edge of the goblet tilted and glimmered a finger's breadth from the prince's lips as Claire stepped forward, 1 pace too late if she had misjudged by even a breath. The base of the goblet met her fingers as if it had always been her duty to steady it. The crystal's foot turned under her thumb. The prince's wrist paused. Not enough to be noticed, enough to be felt. "Forgive me," she said, almost not sound at all. A wobble. Her other hand rose with the twin goblet from the sideboard. Same cut, same weight. She let the boy with the steaming dish cross between her and the table, the moving screen she needed. The switch happened in the space a breath needs to become a word. Her hand left one stem, her other hand delivered the twin. The room did not gasp. It did not know to gasp. The prince set the goblet down a fraction too carefully, as if something in him understood that any haste would tear a veil. His eyes dropped to the scratch at the base, an old mark that told him he held a glass from a set he trusted for its history, if not its contents. He did not drink. Neither did he let not drinking become a spectacle. 2 seats down, a visiting lord lifted his glass without a thought. He had been talking. Men who talk forget to look. His laugh finished the sentence he had been shaping and spilled into the rim. He drank, refilled his mouth with words, and swallowed both. Claire withdrew to the shadow of the vine-carved screen. Her palms stung where they had touched cold. The cupbearer's gaze flicked again, the fisherman's glance that returns to the line when the float moves. He saw nothing to be called error. He saw everything he was paid to ignore. The steward near the private kitchen narrowed his eyes a hair's breadth toward the space where a maid had not been 5 seconds before. He licked his lips. He turned back to the door. A dinner survives by pretending it is always under control. Conversation swelled over the table. Wax wept a clean thread. Silver lifted and set. The visiting lord's hand shook once, so small it might have been the consequence of an oversalted dish. He put his knife down with careful grace and reached for his napkin. The napkin missed his fingers. It was the kind of mistake tired men make. The physician was always somewhere nearby when the court ate. Not because illness loved ceremony, though it did, but because men loved being seen to be cared for. A boy was sent. The boy returned with a man whose face had learned to say reassurance. The physician looked at the lord's pupils, set 2 fingers against his wrist, then let his assistant, young, quick, lift the visiting lord's glass with the cool politeness that claims competence. "Too warm," the physician said to comfort the room. "Air," the maître d'hôtel chimed, as if air could cure dignity. The assistant kept his face bored. Bored faces move unnoticed. He tilted the goblet, as if to pour what remained away, and instead let the dregs slip into a small vial that had been waiting under his cuff. His hands returned the glass to the table. His eyes did not meet Claire's. His eyes did not meet anyone's. The visiting lord rose with help. His mouth tried for a smile that did not trouble his eyes. The physician murmured, "Humors unbalanced, a long day, too quick a swallow on a tired stomach." The phrases fell like cushions under a trip. The room fell back into its calculation of light and cutlery. The prince ate with the measured appetite expected of him. He did not touch the goblet again. His gaze, when it moved like a hand under a cloth, present, unseen. Claire's knees shook once and then obeyed. She did not watch the lord leave. She did not watch the assistant tuck the cork into the vial. She watched only her blue stitch glint and then disappear under a fold, as if what she had done could be tucked away so easily. When the last course had been lifted and the room began to breathe like a body released from lacing, the steward approached the edge of her screen. He did not step fully behind it. He stood in the open, where witnesses are best collected. "You left your station," he said, not loud. "A napkin slipped," she said. "Which?" His eyes slid to the napkin stack. A quick count without appearing to count. "By the 4th place," she said. It was the truth's cousin. He held her a moment longer on the hook of his attention, and then let her down. "Do not be seen solving problems," he murmured. "The court dislikes seeing how its elegance is made." She nodded and lowered her gaze, then raised it once with careful precision. Across the room, the prince's head was tilted slightly toward his own thoughts. When he rose, it was with a stillness that made other men copy him without knowing why. He looked, for the length of one steady breath, toward the screen, not toward her, toward the space she filled. The look was neither permission nor denial. It acknowledged a balance that had tilted and righted without breaking. The dining room emptied into corridors where voices changed shape. Laughter flattened. Talk grew practical. Servants emerged. Silver domes nested. Plates clacked softly in stacks. She moved with the flow, a thread in a stream of threads. The private kitchen received its emptied platters. The garde-manger cooled to its coolness. The bottle with the physician's seal was gone from its place by the sink. A smear of chalk dust marked where the line had been. Her hands found towels and work for hands to do. Work cleans feeling out of limbs. A page darted past with a packet held so delicately it might have been a baby or a bomb. He took the short route toward the prince's rooms, the one courtiers feigned not to notice. Claire stepped aside. The page bandied no courtesy. His face wore the bright importance of someone told to carry something he did not understand. She curved into the servants' passage that runs near the gallery, where the walls reflect light back on itself. The sound there has a different reverberation. It catches confessions and holds them. "Wait," a voice said behind her. Not harsh, not formal, not to be ignored. She turned because turning is safer than refusing. He stood at the mouth of a narrow antechamber, a space for chairs when chairs are not invited into a more important room. The candle he held threw an oval onto plaster. He did not step fully into the service passage. He remained where he could claim to be accidental, if an eye more important than his found him. "You," he said. A word that contained the evening and offered none of it to be spoken. She set her hands at her sides, because hands declare loyalty by what they hold. Highness. The title was a shield, also a distance. He lowered the candle a fraction so that its light would not drag others toward them. "You were behind the screen. You were not meant to be in the room." "I was meant to be useful," she said. "How did you know to be useful now?" Something in his face softened at the edge, not the mouth, the eyes. He was a man trained never to flinch in public. Small shifts betrayed when a man has found a private question he fears he must ask. "The bottle," she said. "In the cold room. Marked for your table. Marked as medicine when no illness has been named. Medicine can be wine," he said, the ghost of a courtly smile making fun of itself. "Medicine can be powder," she answered quick. "Wine carries powder where it is told." He weighed her not for defiance but for sense. "You saw?" "I saw hands," she said, "and chalk dust, and a neck with a chip. Enough." "Names," he said, soft as breath on glass. Her throat tightened. "Names are currency in a place that taxes the poor in secrets. I have none to offer that would buy us safety." He looked past her to the passage's dark. He did not pretend he could protect every poor person in a palace built to glut itself. He had learned what protection costs. "Why warn me?" he asked. The question could have been accusation. It was not. It was wonder wrapped in duty. "Because you breathe," she said, and then shook her head at her own audacity. "Because a wall should not choose who walks away from it." The candle hissed where a drop of wax met the side. "You understand that if you are wrong," he said, the line between each word straight as the crease in his sleeve, "it becomes treason." "If I am right," she said, "it becomes something else." He let silence lie between them until it folded into the rhythm of the house. Then he stepped back, easing himself into rule. "Return to your station," he said, because he must say it. "Do nothing that would bind us to a story we cannot finish." "We are already bound," she said, so low he could pretend he had not heard. He watched her long enough to learn her face, not its prettiness or lack of it, its resolve, its fear's neatness. He put that learning where he kept things he could not trust others to remember for him. "Go," he said, and she went. He remained until the corridor emptied of all but breath. Then he tamped the candle's wick with a practiced pinch and moved toward his rooms with a tread that carried him as if he were always making an entrance even when he wanted to disappear. The outer chamber held a valet who had perfected the art of being at hand without being a hand. The man made to speak. The prince stopped him with a look that broke no agreement and made none. It simply asked for a pause in the world. "The physician," he said, "send his assistant to the outer antechamber. Tell him nothing more than that he is summoned." The valet bowed into action. In the small waiting room where courtiers sit when they are not worth upholstery, the assistant arrived with his face fixed in that pleasant blankness that can mean anything. He held nothing. Empty hands soothe rulers. The prince entered and did not sit. He let the door close with the same quiet the guard had used on the hidden panel earlier. No noise to draw eyes that would repeat what they heard. "You collected the remainder," the prince said. "There was little to collect," the assistant replied. The lord drank as if to please a room. The prince studied the man's features for the flicker of vanity that comes with a secret. He found only a professional's pride. "Do you carry it?" The assistant slipped a vial from his sleeve. Clear glass, a ghost of color inside. He did not extend it fully into the prince's hand. He held it so the prince must take it by the neck, so that none of the liquid would warm from another person's touch. "A trace," the assistant said, as one might remark on the weather. "Do you name it?" The assistant's mouth tightened, then relaxed. "Not here. Not without instruments. It carries a scent of bitter almond. That scent lies sometimes. It can be laurel water in the wrong mouth." The prince nodded once. The assistant understood that his prudence had been received as loyalty. He bowed and departed by the longer way, so that anyone who needed to see him leave would have time to decide the errand had been innocent. Left alone, the prince held the vial up to candlelight. The liquid made a thin lens over the glass. He turned it. It clung. He placed it beside the note still on his desk. The two objects glared at each other, warning and proof. He returned the torn scrap to his fingers. The purple stamp winked like a bruise. Who would have thought to use the linen room's stubs as a library of paper? Whoever had warned him had known how to move unseen where more important feet never imagined space existed. The guard's report of a figure in his wing returned to him like thunder belated. He pictured boots, a pike, torchlight edging a seam. If they had found a maid in a wall, the story would already be running through rooms like a contagion. No story had come. That meant the men had found dust and chosen quiet. His request for quiet had been honored. He would remember that, and the men who had honored it. A knock, light and almost cheerful, pecked at the outer door. The prince did not call. The door opened a sliver, permission smuggled past etiquette by long practice. A page slipped in with a packet cradled in both hands. "From the king's secretary," the boy murmured, thrilled to be required, terrified to be noticed. "He begs a signature." "At this hour?" the prince asked mildly. "The secretary's desk never sleeps," the boy said, the sort of line only children can deliver without sounding like a fool. The prince relieved the packet of its burden. "Go," he said, and the boy went, already rehearsing how he would tell about not being made to wait. The paper wore cheapness like a disguise. It should have been on the heavy stock the secretary loved. He slit the wrapping with the careful fingernail kings learn early not to break until witnessed. Inside, an envelope sealed in dark wax. The impression molded into the seal carried a familiar wound, a small nick at the rim of a signet, the memory of a mishap during a tour in youth. He had laughed at that nick then. He had known he could always recognize it in crowds of red wax. The superscription was not to him. It carried, in an imitation of the secretary's formal hand, the name of a captain of the Swiss Guard. The letter nested inside might have found its proper owner if the page had not been instructed to place it on the wrong desk, or the right one, depending on what story was being written around him. He did not call for anyone to witness his breach of an envelope not addressed to him. He pressed his thumb against the wax's nick and let it crack. The page within bore a simple cipher. The kind old mentors teach students to keep them from being fools. Each alternate letter belonged to another sentence. Reading down and then back made meaning. He crossed the lines with his eyes. The message rose like stitching, an arrangement for the next public ball. The door at the southern end would be undermanned. The captain would allow a group of masked gentlemen to pass under color of charity. A hand signal, a fan moved in a certain way, would mark the moment the prince stood at the right edge of the floor. The timing would be exact, the gap an act of courtesy to guests who would not like to be kept waiting. No names, no threats, only logistics. The kind of letter that proves nothing until it is held next to a knight where a goblet is steadied and a lord fails not to tremble. He turned the sheet and saw in the footer a flourish he knew. Not the secretary's. The curl of a D that always made too much of itself. The language of a man who believed even his pen made music. The room tilted an inch. He sat because the body advises the mind when thought rules too long. He let the nothing in him look for excuses. The signet could be stolen. The hand could be forged. The kindness could be mischief. Perhaps the Duke meant a test. Perhaps. He could not unsee the wax's nick. He could not forget the warmth in the voice that had taught him which ministers to trust when he had barely known how to trust his own steps. He could not ignore the way loyal men sometimes make themselves tyrants in the name of service. The note on the desk made a quiet argument for believing the invisible. The vial made a quiet argument for believing the worst. The letter made no argument. It simply laid its parts in a row and waited for a finger to trace them. He aligned the torn linen room stamp with the bottom of the warning. He placed the vial above it. He set the letter, open, to the right. He liked his chaos catalogued. He needed it to be, if he was to carry it into rooms that punished any man who allowed feeling to sit on the surface of his voice. The latch of the inner door slipped and caught. It was a genteel sound, the rehearsal of a visit. He lifted his head and saw the silhouette he had been taught by years of tutelage to recognize by outline alone. Candle or no candle. The man always entered as if admit is a word that applies only to others. He stepped into the light with hands composed and face settled into paternal calm. His gaze dropped, as any intelligent gaze would, to the desk. The note, the torn scrap, the vial, the open letter with its broken seal. His eyes rose to the prince's, and he reached back without turning his head to close the door from the inside, shutting them into a room where the air knew too much. The door clicked, not loud, final. The Duke let his glove rest a heartbeat on the panel, as if to reassure the wood of his gentleness. He crossed the room with the same unhurried grace that had once steadied a boy through 100 firsts. His eyes took in the objects on the desk as one might note the weather. The note, the torn scrap, the vial like a small eye, the opened letter with its broken seal and its handwriting that had learned how power curls a stroke. "My dear," he said, voice softened as if they were back in the old library where he had corrected the prince's Greek. "You look drawn." "Do I?" the prince answered. He kept his hands open on the desk, claiming nothing, hiding nothing. The candle made both men's faces landscapes of light and discipline. The Duke's gaze touched the wax nick in the seal and did not pretend not to recognize it. It swept to the vial and did not linger. It returned to the prince with a calm that would have soothed a wilder heart. "This is an unfriendly arrangement of objects." "It is that," the prince said. "So you have been warned," the Duke murmured. "By someone fond of melodrama, and by someone with a gift for delivery to the wrong door." "The letter's door was not wrong," the prince said. "It reached the desk of the man most in danger of it." "Then we agree," the Duke said gently. "You must not be in danger." Silence adjusted its weight. The Duke did not step closer. He knew how distance confers benevolence. "You are not a boy at a fencing lesson anymore. You will not be fooled by a carnival trick. The court feeds on theatre. One learns to tame it with a little theatre of one's own." "A test, then?" the prince said. "A measure," the Duke replied. The word came like a bomb. Others will move because men with bright blood like to move. One arranges a harmless intrusion. One watches one's guards. One notes who speaks well, who falters. You learn which boards creak. It is how we preserve you for the long labor. "A harmless intrusion," the prince repeated. with men carrying canes heavy enough to matter. Props, the Duke said, a smile in the voice, not on the mouth. You see props in every hand once you have learned to play. You must, however, play. To flinch is to teach wolves their lesson too well. The prince studied the man who had taught him to marshal his features until they marched. The Duke's eyes were not cruel. They were certain. Certainty can be more dangerous than malice. The ball is a crowded classroom, the Duke continued low. Let the drill proceed. Reassure the court with your lightness. If someone stumbles, his glance flicked toward the vial and away, we will have learned what we needed to learn without frightening anyone important. Important, the prince said without inflection. The idea, not the person, the Duke said quickly. Important to the idea of the crown we serve. Service. The old word, buffed to a shine by generations. The prince let it sit between them. He touched the open letter with 2 fingers, flattening a corner that did not need flattening. Then we are agreed, he said, tone even. We will conduct a lesson. I suppose I must attend it well. The Duke inclined his head, as if the exchange had been about music for the evening. You have your mother's steadiness. Use it tonight. There is a reason we trained you never to hurry your gaze. And if someone in the orchestra plays off the page, the prince asked. Then we will change the page, the Duke said. He moved back toward the door with the same careful confidence. Rest now. Wear the color that lifts your skin. It reassures fools. And be seen speaking amiably to the captain. He is too literal to understand that he's being given a holiday. He opened the door no wider than the width of his body and slid out, leaving the room to its objects and their dangerous alignment. The prince stood in the small deflated silence that follows the exit of a presence that once filled most of a life. He did not touch the letter again. He did not pour away the vial. He folded the warning note, not to hide it, but to keep it from the candle's drip. He rang for no one, then rang once, quietly, for a man he knew would knock twice and wait without impatience. The loyal equerry entered with a bow that respected both forms and the hour. The prince raised a hand to spare him speech. You will take a word to 3 men, he said. No more. They have names only we speak when needed. You will say the southern door needs watching, not by lords in lace, by hands that know how to hold without being seen. They will look for a cane that weighs too much. They will watch for a fan raised too deliberately. And they will not draw attention unless there is a need to. The equerry allowed his eyes to flick once to the items on the desk and away. It will be done. The physician's assistant will be within reach, the prince added. Not front and center, within reach. And the captain? The equerry asked. The question packed into itself a decade of frustrations trailing that officious man's wake. Let him obey the instructions he has been given, the prince said. We will see which instructions he thinks hold priority in his moral order. The equerry sank backward, silent, into the corridor, and took the message without the weight showing as it changed his spine. When the room was his again, the prince stood in the middle of it and breathed until his chest found the rhythm he had learned in hunting fields years ago. Slow in, slower out. He set the signet with the nick inside a drawer, not out of grief, out of tidiness. He adjusted his cuff. He left the chamber without the flurry of attendants that marked a sovereign's dramatic departures, and walked to the long mirror where a valet waited with fine indifference and clever fingers. Blue, the prince said softly. The one that offends no one. The valet understood exactly what color requires to be noticed enough to be remembered and not so much as to be remarked upon. He brought the coat, the clean linen, the small loop of ribbon at the shoulder where ceremony likes to hang justification. By the hour when mirrors multiply candles into false day, the Galerie des Glaces flowed with people. Silk collided with brocade and pretended not to. Powder gave the air flavor. The floor had been polished to a treachery the young admired, and older men respected. The musicians tuned quietly, aware that music exists in a court at the mercy of conversation. Claire reached the southern end before the worst of the press. Duty had been a passport. She carried a tray of glasses as if the tray had written her a letter of introduction. A place at the sideboard had been noted by the steward with a flick of a pen. There was nothing to see here. A maid arranging crystal by height and cut. A maid counting twice. A maid using breath to banish a fleck. Her eyes were elsewhere. The door she could see from her station was not the grand one. It was the polite door people of rank affected to prefer when making a point of not needing to be announced. 2 guards held their long halberds with the ease of men who have been taught that ease intimidates more reliably than bark. The captain of the Swiss was there, sweat drying under his wig, lips pressed into what he thought a line of command. She watched the angle of his shoulders, the way one watches for a clock to strike. Shoulders tell the truth before mouths do. A ribboned group of children sang near the opposite end in thin, sweet voices, a charity gesture beloved because it costs little and photographs the heart in flattering light. The court turned toward it. That turning thinned attention where she stood. She did not look at the prince when he entered. She felt the room inhale and knew he had, because rooms tell you when a center has walked into them. He was where he was supposed to be, light caught in the harmless sheen of his coat. The Duke floated beyond him like a benign planet, orbit chosen to appear natural. Claire adjusted a goblet at the edge of her table that did not need adjustment. She monitored the guard pattern. At the appointed quarter hour, the captain made a tiny, ridiculous gesture as if shooing a fly. His men stepped 2 paces outward, courteous, useless, unless one means to leave a seam. The seam opened. It was small seams flood ships. 3 men in masks moved in a knot thick enough to be innocent. Their coats were unremarkable in exactly the way remarked things contrived to be. One carried a cane topped with a polite knob, carver's work disguising mass. The cane's ferrule struck parquet as if testing its own theater. The men entered under the tide of applause that followed the children's last note. Applause covers many intrusions. Claire moved her stack of clean napkins a finger to the left. She had to pretend to be small to see what mattered. The masked men positioned as if to admire a mirror. The man with the cane turned his body half away, shielded by a companion's broad back. His hand traveled to the fob at his waist and lifted it. The fob tugged. A latch kissed open. The cane's ornament rotated. Her breath did not quicken. It sank. She took 2 steps around the end of the sideboard, with the absent-minded swiftness of someone catching a fresh glass for a guest she has seen too late. She cut a clean path between 2 talking ladies without snagging a hem. Across the vast brightness, the prince was counting. He had placed himself as the letter had predicted, the southern edge, where men with obligations can be found by those who seek them. His ears divided sound into threads, musicians beginning a well-mannered minuet, the low conversation of ministers who all but hid their own whispers in their palms, the murmur of the Duke's voice sliding kindly over a junior courtier's nerves. He saw the captain move his men in what could be defended later as a kindness to the charitable group. He did not look directly at the door. The muscles of his face were at school. The muscles in his hand, by contrast, flexed against the satin of his glove. Keeping hands relaxed is work no one applauds. A woman across the room raised her fan and made an artless flourish that would have been nothing on any other night. He saw it because he had been told to see it. He turned a degree as if admiring a chandelier's cut. In the mirror within a mirror within the mirror, he saw 3 men not admiring anything at all. The friend with the broad back completed his sheltering turn. The cane lifted. The knob twisted and came free. Beneath, a slender tube gleamed oily, catching candlelight like a fish just before it breaks water. The hand at the fob tightened. The triggering movement would be small, a lover's touch. He did not move. Claire reached the sweet spot where one body may nudge another in high society without becoming an incident. She let her thigh bump the cane-bearer's elbow in that exact, invisible pressure servants learn in crowded rooms. She apologized under her breath as if the fault were hers by nature. The gentle shock skewed the tube a hair to the left. The pellet lifted from the tube with a hiss no one but the man holding it could hear. It flew not toward the prince's ribs, where a dart can find skin under buttons, but toward a sconce, where two beeswax candles flirted. It struck bronze and spat a snake of smoke that bit eyes and stirred the room's temper into a draught of confusion. The prince moved on the air more than the floor. He took one step deeper into the open, into light, into sight. It had been agreed that the lesson would end without a scene. The scene had offered itself nonetheless. He raised his voice not by volume but by clarity. "Gentlemen," he said, and proclaimed nothing. He let the word do the work. The loyal men he had placed moved with the confidence of an instruction that has been truly understood. Two closed from the left. One tripped the cane-bearer's ankle as neatly as if he were checking a horse's hoof. The cane struck the floor. The hidden mechanism popped free with the eager relief of springs. It lay opened like a throat on the parquet. The second man seized the wrist with the fob, twisting not as a soldier would to dislocate, but as a valet does when he removes a ring from a drunk man's finger, quick, efficient, inevitable. The third palmed the pellet that had not flown and tucked it into a paper already waiting. The captain of the Swiss strode toward the gap he had made with a face arranged to appear indignant. "Your Highness," he began. Piety laid over offense like icing too thick. "Attend to your post," the prince said without looking at him. He bent and took up the cane himself. The inner tube was slick with something that left the fingertips faintly mordant. The physician's assistant, hovering exactly at the distance requested, stepped forward, and with the courtesy of a man asking to borrow salt, extended a strip of paper. The prince allowed the assistant to swab the residue. The young man lifted the paper to his nose and did not speak the name of what he smelled. He glanced once at the prince, and that glance said enough. Danger barely masked by a fashionable tincture. Masks came off under the firm hands of loyal guards. Faces emerged like bad memories. One man pulled free a second, smaller weapon, a blade trimmed for the inside of a sleeve, and found his wrist already caught. The ribbon in his pocket slid to the floor. A courtier's wife, nearby and too wise to pretend she had seen nothing, recognized its stitching and whispered to her neighbor that such ribbons had passed through the Duke's secretary's hands all week, under the pretense of organizing donors for the children's choir. The Duke did not bolt. He moved forward with serene authority and opened his mouth to write the narrative that would be easier on certain men's throats. "Your Highness," he said, a touch of grief in the address. "This is the risk when we bring the city into our pure rooms. A prank, a foolishness, encouraged by some impetuous wit. Let us not humiliate the crown by—" The prince lifted his free hand, palm toward the older man, a student's gesture to a master, and that made the check subtle and devastating. He opened his other hand and showed the room a small circle of wax. The nick at its rim caught firelight like a star. He did not name the seal. He did not need to. Men look at exposed objects as they look at exposed shame, quickly and with memory. A murmur rose. It was not a mob sound. It was the quiet violence of reordering. Ministers moved in, not at the king's waving. No waving was needed for this. They had been summoned by the room's change of temperature. Their faces were not animated. They were composed. One took custody of the cane with careful fingers. Another gathered the ribbons. A third addressed the captain, in a voice that would read a man's last confession without blinking. "You opened a gap." "I obeyed an order," the captain said, honest with the pride of small men who believe obedience absolves judgment. "Whose?" the minister asked. The captain's mouth moved. The Duke spared him the humiliation of saying the name. "My hand wrote a drill," the older man said, eyes falling for the first time from certainty to something like acceptance. "If the instrument had no music in it, who would have blamed me? If it was loaded when I imagined it empty, then perhaps I have been too generous in trusting men's amusements." "You are generous," the prince said, and let the word sit unsweetened. He handed the ministers the letter without dramatics. He lifted the cane and its small, brutal heart. He did not direct accusation at the Duke. He laid fact on a table surrounded by witnesses, skilled in sharpening fact into procedure. The physician's assistant, having secured the samples, bowed a small bow that did not presume to take credit for timing. He stepped back into the seam of the crowd and became a face again, one among many. Claire had moved from the sideboard to a position just behind a pillar when the smoke coughed up. She stood very still there, a woman hiding in plain sight as always, but newly visible to anyone looking for the person who had moved where she should not. That is the cost of stepping between a mechanism and a body. A steward's eyes found her, catalogued her, and wrote, silently, either a reprimand or a commendation she could not read. The masked men were led away without spectacle. Their masks dangled like wilted flowers in the hands of soldiers who knew better than to bruise a scene. The captain placed himself behind the ministers as if their shadow might cancel his shape. The Duke folded his hands in front of him and looked down at them for the first time that night. He had not lost all his grace. He had lost enough that the room inhaled differently. The prince turned in a slow radius, meant to meet eyes without creating an audience of any one man. When his gaze found Claire's across the churned sheen of the floor, it held for a breath. It was not a rescue. It was not a promise. It was the exact measure of recognition allowed to a prince who had been instructed never to owe anyone anything. A thank you bent into a look. The music, abandoned on the staff, trickled back under the bow of a violinist who believed in restoring ordinary time. Conversation resumed in tatters, then wove itself. The ministers signaled that private interviews would replace public drama. Men who had allowed themselves to be entertained reshaped their faces into expressions of sober relief. A steward whispered to a steward. Protocol returned like a tide that had pretended it would not, and then inevitably did. The Duke stepped back into the cluster of men who would anchor him for as long as a man that weighty can be anchored before he must be untied. He did not plead. He waited, framed by the room's indifference. Claire returned to her station with the small, precise tread that tells a room the servant has not forgotten what she is. She felt heat on her cheeks and did not lift a hand to it. A pair of noble eyes followed her as if measuring wrongdoing as a novelty. Another pair followed her with something like gratitude, quickly hidden. The prince inclined his head to the musicians, to the wall of mirrors, to the idea that the court would spin again as if nothing had been threatened. He had done what he had to do without shouting. He had added a weight to the scale that had, until tonight, been loaded on the other side. He had not yet paid for it. He knew the bill always arrives. He looked once more to the pillar's shadow. Then he turned away, and the ballroom's glitter adjusted around him, accepting the shape of an evening that would be told tomorrow in whispers quieter than truth. The council room had morning light like a blade. It fell straight across the polished table, catching in the grain and the gold edges of ledgers. The ministers took their places in a choreography that looked like order and felt like siege. The prince came last, not to arrive late, but to allow the room to look at itself before it looked at him. A chair waited at the head. He did not throw his weight into it. He lowered himself as if the wood could bruise. The vial sat to his right, stoppered, clear. The seized cane's inner mechanism lay in a velvet-lined box, its ugliness tamed by cloth. The broken seal rested near his hand, the nicked rim a small scar in red. The letter lay open, lines calm in their treachery. He wanted the room to see the quiet of these things. Noise makes excuses. Quiet condemns. A minister cleared his throat. "Highness." "We begin," the prince said. He did not raise his voice, he placed it. "What cannot be denied will not be denied in this room." The Duke stood opposite, within reach of the light. He did not shrink from it. His face had arranged itself into something like patience. He looked, almost, like a tutor waiting for a pupil to make an error, so he could correct it without humiliating him. That memory stung the prince more than any argument. "We have the object," a minister said, nodding to the velvet. "We have the arrangement of guards. We have the letter that assumed compliance. We have—" His gaze slid to the Duke, then back to the table. "The seal." "A drill," the Duke said, tone mild. a test of readiness, rehearsed too cleverly. Men intoxicated by the idea of playing danger without understanding the shape of it. I regret the indulgence. Who authorized indulgence? The prince kept his eyes on the letter, as if reading, though he had memorized it. I did, the Duke answered. He did not fidget. And if a hand beneath mine balked at being disciplined and chose to decorate the prop, then my culpability is negligence, not malice. Names, a different minister said, voice dry as paper. I will not trade boys to the gallows to be called loyal by a crowd, the Duke replied. They obeyed the shadow I cast. My shadow is mine. The room shifted. No one in it, not even the prince, could pretend that answer was cowardly. It was the kind of courage that ruins and saves men by turns. The prince let the quiet live until it threatened to become fog. Then he cut it. The captain opened a seam on order, he said. The men entered on order. The letter traveled sealed by hands that understand how to move messages through our house. What is rehearsed is not random. A minister, older, who had watched kings grow and lose their tempers, placed his fingertips together. The crown cannot be seen to eat its own heart in public, he said. But the crown must be seen to have a heart. The prince turned his head a fraction and met the older man's eyes. Then we will do both. A clerk brought forward a paper already drawn. Not verdict, process. Words like examine, confine, review. The ink still glistened. The prince read enough to be sure it punished without blood. He signed. The scratch of the quill sounded like a hinge closing. The Duke inclined his head, accepting the enclosure of his world without theatrics. I am at the crown's disposal, he said. I have always been. The phrasing tucked itself under the prince's ribs. He remembered a boy who had believed that meant safety. He set the quill down with care. You are confined to your apartments, he said. Your papers will be examined. Your secretary will be questioned at length. You will not write letters tonight. The Duke's mouth softened a breath. Tonight is a poor night for eloquence, he said. Highness, whatever story is written with my name in it, make certain it keeps you alive. The prince did not answer aloud. The door opened and two men took position, not near enough to shame a great man, near enough to mark a boundary. The Duke nodded to the room that had been his stage and walked between them with a back so straight it denied the existence of hinges or age. The ministers uncreased themselves. The physician's assistant waited by the door, respectful, anonymous. The prince gestured. The young man approached, bowed, took the velvet box and vial to a side table, where an inventory would be made without mistakes. A minister cleared his throat again. Highness, there is another matter. He glanced at the list he always carried. A maid was observed near the southern pillar during last night's disturbance. The same maid was behind the screen at supper. Her proximity to the prince's person may raise comment. The prince kept his gaze flat. So will our silence. Do we censure or reward? The minister asked it as one asks about choosing a fork, calmly, aware that choice changes appetite. The prince folded the warning note once, twice, until it was small and strong between his fingers. We recognize loyalty, he said. We instruct discretion. We do not encourage spectacle. She will be protected from punishment and from envy. Draft how? The minister wrote as he was told and did not smile. There are pleasures in obeying a prince who knows what he wants that are different from flattery. Have the secretary read it in the proper place? The prince added. Not here. We will not bring a maid into a theatre for men. Highness? The older minister bowed. Respect, relief, a little pride hid under his courtesy. The crown had remembered to be gentle, and that gentleness would travel. The meeting ended by thinning rather than by closing. Men slipped away, swallowing their own words. The prince stood alone with the light blade and his breathing. He had not felt this weight when he hunted, or when he danced, or when he learned whole dynasties by branch. He felt it now, right behind the breastbone, as if his body had finally understood what his life was for. He pocketed the folded note. It was improper. It was necessary. He left by the corridor that did not announce departures. Claire's name lay open on the linen room ledger, as if it had been put there deliberately by a hand she could not imagine. The chamberlain sat with a quill, and an expression like a lid clapped on simmering milk. 2 ministers occupied the narrow room as if to prove the place could be filled with importance as easily as with steam. Claire stood with her back straight, not to display pride, simply to keep her lungs from crushing under nerves. The room smelled of ink and boiled cloth. A clock ticked from somewhere it had no business being. The chamberlain did not waste time on scolding. He folded his own hands together and glanced at the older minister, who nodded. "The prince has directed," the chamberlain said, "that the maid Claire Duret in recent days demonstrated steadiness of mind and hand in the face of an incident that might have injured the crown." The younger minister corrected gently, "Harmed. We will not name injury where it did not land." "Harmed," the chamberlain said, and added careful. "She has preserved decorum and prevented greater disturbance." Claire's fingers knit themselves against the corse of her apron. "I did my work," she said too quickly, then slowed. "I wished to do no harm." The older minister watched her, as one watches a candle, happy if it burns, unhappy if it flares. Work sometimes looks like interference to those who dislike seeing it. Regardless, His Highness has directed that you not be censured. You will remain in your station. Additionally, he glanced to his left. The secretary of the prince unrolled a small strip of paper. A modest pension will be paid to your family while you continue in service. It will be explained to no one who does not need explanation. Claire's breath left and returned in the same shape. The words did not lift her. They set her down somewhere safer. "My family," she said, and the syllables felt heavy enough to dent the table. "To be administered through the steward," the secretary added, voice neutral. "He too has been instructed about discretion." The chamberlain picked up his quill. "Do you wish to add anything?" Claire lifted her head. The trim of the minister's cuffs caught on her sight. The room was too small to hold the bigness of what she wanted to say, so she made it small. "I saw something wrong," she said. "I corrected a place setting." The younger minister's mouth twitched. "So be it," he said. "Correct places if you must, but only as noiselessly as you have." "Yes, monsieur," she said. The secretary set the written notice on the table, signed with the sharp, elegant loop that signaled a prince's words without making him a witness in the wrong way. The chamberlain pressed sand and blew gently. The action carried a strange tenderness. He was covering the wet with something clean so it would not smear. "You may go," the older minister said. Then, unexpectedly, his voice softened a degree. "Take care of your hands." Claire nodded and left, because to remain would invite a meaning no one could survive. The corridor beyond felt brighter than it had an hour ago. She crossed it with the firm tread of someone pretending she had not